So we're here with Ethan Grossman. Ethan has been a trainer in New York City for probably, about 7 years?
Yeah, 7 years.
I met Ethan when he was about 23 years old. He's 27 now. He impressed me a long time ago. He was way above his years, but he always had this passion to become a bodybuilder. Has studied under very smart people, Pat Davidson being one of his closest friends and mentors, right?
He was my best man.
Right, we love that. And I think I want to get into your story a little bit, and I want to start back to school and the trajectory of everything, because it's impressive. It's also a little bit different than I think what a lot of bodybuilders and fitness people have been exposed to.
But I want to actually just, before that, when you guys saw each other, it was the first time you saw him in how many years?
I haven't seen him, so that 23, it has to be 3 years, 4 years.
And how much bigger was he?
Probably gained 50, 60 pounds?
Yeah, I'm 265 now. I might have been, 220.
Has that been your heaviest? I know you did a show recently, or?
Yeah. So, I competed, around 200. I dieted down from, 235, 240. This is the heaviest. It's fun. I'm learning a lot.
And you're going to compete in the open class?
Yeah, compete open. So the goal. So I'm 5'11", and you got a picture of Ronnie Coleman up there, who's also 5'11".
Yeah.
Right, good height to be, but you got to put on a lot of size to fill that frame. So the current goal is to get up to 300 pounds by 2021, and DEXA scan 15% body fat. So, it's like building out a business plan. You say, okay, this is the time frame. This is where we want to go. Let's work backwards. And you say, okay, these are sort of like the parameters we need to fill. What are the tools we have to fill them? Let's find the right tools for the right job. And some of that is, finding mentors and, just having to learn new things along the way, which I just find super fun.
Now, I want to back up and just do a quick couple minutes on your education. How'd this start for you? And then I want to dive right into, the trajectory, this path for you over the last 4 years. Because to take your body, for anyone to take their body from 220, 200 pounds, call it what you want, 50, 60, 70 pounds with an additional 30, 40 pounds to grow. There's few people in the world who could say they did that while keeping body fat that low. 15% on a DEXA is... that if you can do that at 300 pounds, that's pretty, and you will, and I know you will.
The last one was 250 at 10, shortly after this show. And I would say I remember being, 150 pounds when I started lifting. So that kind of starts the story, right? Like 12 years old. Well, let me just say thanks for having me, guys. Zach, I haven't met you before, but I've been watching some of these podcasts. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hopefully
Don.
not the old ones. They were horrible. No, I was kidding.
They're all old now.
Well, they're really old ones. But no, it's a pleasure to meet you. I would say that too, because I'm also terrified of you because you're so big.
I'll take that as a compliment. Don, we go back a little ways, and I don't have any social media presence. Like I have nothing to sell. Usually at the end of these things, they ask where can people find you? And it's I don't reach out to Pat, and then he'll vet you and we can talk. But this is just for fun, and it's there were really two things that made me want to do this rather than turn it down or pass it on to Pat. One was the first magazine I ever picked up, going back to 150 pound Ethan, was a Flex magazine, and had Lee Haney on the cover. Had probably been training for a year or so at that time, but I had all of the muscle and fitness magazines stacked up month after month, and now the avenue for information is a little bit different. We have video.
What are you talking about? Magazines of the future. No. Yeah, it's easier to find this information, and there's a lot more of it.
I get so much good information now through podcasts or audiobooks and stuff like that. So if I can help other people that were in the same position. So there's that. And then, with Don, when I came to New York, again, sort of seeking out the right mentors and the right tools for the job. His gym's, one of the most prestigious gyms in New York City. And with that, he has some really good talent there. One of my good friends, Connor Ryan, was a physical therapist. Great. Love Connor. So, I was working with Connor at the time. We met each other. And the really cool thing, Don's this trainer to the stars, owner of this gym. But really why, I'm here is because, Don and I went out to Bev Francis, right? And we hit legs. So it's okay, this guy talks the talk, looks the part.
Try and hang with him.
He walks the walk.
No,
and I really appreciate that. I don't really want to talk to people who don't walk the walk. So that's what's fun about
I'll
this.
never forget this leg session him and I had. We going. It was like a field trip. Like he came out from the city, or from Jersey. I don't know where were you living? Jersey?
Yeah.
Yeah, he came out from Jersey, and I was like, all right, we're going to get a great work. We're probably going to end up hitting him for 2 hours. I'm going to try and keep up with him, which I'm not going to be able to, but if I can hang in there, great. And we're going to go to Yim's afterwards, and we're going to eat some steamed flank and rice and broccoli. And we honestly did that. When you do that with someone, there's a bond. There's something that you share. You almost, it sounds like very corny, but you're almost like going to war in a fashion that's really special. Like for him and for myself, going and doing those experiences. For me, it's like very special. It's like breaking bread with someone. It's like going out and drinking wine and having food. When you go to the gym with someone, it's like a special moment.
Completely agree.
Yeah, it's awesome. So sorry about my rant there, but
No.
I'm getting all teary-eyed.
I don't think we've had a special moment.
Oh my God. We will.
I mean,
So that's like where it starts, right? Is, you're seeing Ronnie Coleman in the magazines, you're following the muscle and fitness routines. And I think with that also going to places like Bev's and being exposed to sort of like, the hardcore first. People say like, well, don't go and follow Ronnie Coleman's routine. Don't do what he did. But to be exposed to that mentality, now we're in a place where, you're interviewing PhDs, about exercise science, and they're guiding our nutrition. And before it was the bodybuilders. We picked up Arnold's Encyclopedia, which, I still have. But to start from that standpoint, I think really built a lot of like grit. Where it doesn't matter if it's, hailing outside. It doesn't matter, what the circumstances are around you. Like, you're going to make it happen. So weird things would happen in the process of, like, trying to stick to that, which, looking back now from a scientific standpoint, were crazy. But they built grit. So I can remember, like, dieting for my first show. And this was actually...
What year was this?
I would have been 18, so I was born in 91.
Okay, I can't do the math, so I just didn't know if you
2009.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so, even in the off season, right, it was still following like a strict meal plan, and I remember I had my wisdom teeth removed. And at that time, it's like, salmon is not like a thing that you put in a box in terms of like, okay, there's protein and it's got omega-3 fatty acids. It's like, no, salmon is magic, and because it's written on your program. And brown rice is magic because it's written on your program. And like, you don't even think to deviate from it. It's not like, oh, I have a protein bar. Now it's like, if it fits your macros. And I agree with a lot of that stuff, don't get me wrong. But I had my wisdom teeth removed. The plan was like, salmon, brown rice. Cooked the salmon, brown rice, blended it warm. I still have a picture of it, it's literally like the first one on my phone. And, it's those kind of, experiences, right? Like the guy that was in here earlier was on the Iron Sports team, which is a team that I started in college for like bodybuilding, strongman, powerlifting.
Okay.
Yeah. We had some like professional strongmen come out of there. One guy that just competed in the Arnold Classic. So we had a lot of really successful people come out of there. But we also had a lot of guys and girls that weren't necessarily bodybuilders or like aspiring, professional athletes. But, maybe they were like computer programmers, or nowadays, like, there's gym teachers. I'm thinking about all the weddings I'm going to now that I'm in my late 20s. And these guys are like all doing things completely unrelated to fitness, but the mentality that it built, right? Before we really had all the information, I can remember going in and having a whole workout that was like, we're going to do 1,000 pull-ups today. Like between the three of us, like however long that takes, we're just going to do it. And you do some stupid things that, don't necessarily fit the science, but you learn how to be gritty. And I think that was really like the beginnings. And, you just learn to sort of like find a way. Like my first gym was a gym that like I made money from like mowing lawns. I cleaned out my basement. I painted my basement, put a few pieces of equipment down there, trained down there. When that ran out, went to the school gym, to the world gym, and then eventually to the gym, which actually had, some pretty successful pro bodybuilders. Your Bob Ciccarellos, George Farahs, these guys that, would sort of later introduce me to the competitive scene. But it was just kind of like that one brick at a time. And then in laying those bricks, you eventually hit a point, or most people hit a point, unless you're just so gifted that works forever, that something goes wrong, or what you were doing before isn't working anymore. And then that's now an opportunity to learn something. And that's where, you know, kind of what I think we're here to talk about today is like, okay, now you need a new tool, or you know, you need to approach it from a different angle. And, you know, that's where I made the decision. In high school, like a lot of people, I started lifting for football. It was just like, you know, bigger, stronger, faster. And it's not uncommon for people to realize like, I'm probably not going to be a professional, you know, football player. So now you have these like crossroads, right? And it was like, well, I actually like lifting better than, you know, I like the sports themselves. Not too uncommon. And it was like, I was fortunate because I was born like in an era where you could go to school for exercise science, which was like kind of a new thing. So it was like, I can make a career out of this. This is what I do for fun. Like, I'm just going to go to school and have fun. And that's kind of been the story ever since. Like, everything that I've done, it's because I thought it was going to be fun. And like, I think this is going to be fun. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, backing up to, you know, he talked about those gritty sessions, and it's been there. Some of the most memorable days of your training life would be just going in there and just saying, we're just going to squat today. Or just, you know, the next, you know, you're 90 minutes in and who knows how many reps you've done. But that, I mean, even though looking back on that, you know, you could say, because everyone's a scientist now in the fitness industry. They all want to, you know, it's science. I'm like, according to who? Some social media goof? Like, let's face it, like, there's plenty of research that you've read over the last decade that might be obsolete now, or maybe they found a better way to do things. And, you know, you can't devalue. I mean, we all want to sound like we're scientists, and we all want to sound like we're this expert. But listen, Dorian Yates did a pretty damn good job. Ronnie Coleman did a pretty damn good job. Flex Wheeler, all these guys, you know, there's looking at their training now. Could you say, are there better, are there smarter ways to do things? Yes, but you said something to me 4 years ago. You don't remember saying this, but you're like, it's your job to go and create tension. Like, you're in there trying to put tension on the body to be able to stimulate what you need to stimulate. And for a young guy, lots of young guys are more concerned with moving mass amounts of weight. He is strong as hell. I remember you picking up 515 pounds without warming up off the floor with Connor that day when we were at the gym. And you just yanked it no problem off the floor. And you're like, oh, I haven't deadlifted in a while. I'm like, you didn't even warm up. You just pulled Connor's max, which for Connor's, you know, probably Connor can pull some weight. But, you know, this is someone that... Yeah, I'm interested to get into his insight a little bit on how your training has changed since those days. What is it like going back and saying, you know, what you did, what was good about what you were doing, and where has it really evolved? I really want to just dive right into that now.
Yeah, and another thing is, like, what was the point that made you, like, come to that conclusion? Like, was there, like, some epiphany, or was it, like, something somebody's, you know what I mean? Like, that, I think that's important, too.
So there was one moment where I had to make a decision, like, do I want to try to play football in college, or do I want to go and pursue exercise science? And it was simply because the best school in the country for exercise science, you know, to my knowledge, was Springfield College, because that's kind of what they do. They were a YMCA, and now they're a 4-year university. Typically, if you go there, you're going for something related to, you know, the physical therapy, exercise science, like, you know, that kind of field. And that was a Division III school. And, you know, if I was going to do something, like, I wanted to try to do it at the highest level. So I do remember actually sitting down with a piece of paper, like, line down the middle, football, you know, exercise science. Like, I remember that was a distinct moment. You know, and I made that decision. I only applied to Springfield College, early decision. Technically, if I didn't get in, like, I wouldn't have gone to school, but I wasn't too worried about it. So, you know, that I knew exactly where I wanted to go. And, yeah, as far as the decision to sort of, there's no particular decision to make, like, a more scientific approach. It's simply just like a need.
Yeah, well, what I meant was, like, you know, you talked about it before. Did you hit that plateau, or was there something that somebody said that kind of made you realize, like, I gotta make a change here. Like, this is not working for me anymore. Like, what I'm doing needs to evolve. Yeah. Just something like did something like that happen? You
know, the thing about, you know, bodybuilding or just trying to create any kind of physiological change, they tend to be low and slow processes. They take a long time. So, you know, some people will say, like, oh, you know, I changed this exercise and, like, my pecs grew more. I'm like, No, you didn't. Like, you looked in the mirror, like you did a set and then it was like better. Doesn't make any sense. So a lot of these things are tough to analyze, like on a moment by moment basis. You know, even the smartest sort of like most well equipped researchers cannot really measure muscle growth on, you know, an acute scale very well. But, you know, when you enjoy it and you learn that there might be a better way to do something, you just sort of analyze it in a very objective way. And I think it's just enjoying that process of learning. Like, it's very difficult to say, you know, you got to a point where just like absolutely nothing was happening, because everything is sort of happening like in a contiguous manner. You know, there's so many things, you know, there's so much interplay, not just like with your training, but also just with your lifestyle, like your environment, your psychology, and all this stuff is playing on each other. Like your, you know, physiology affects your psychology and vice versa. So there's so much interplay. I think we give too much credit sometimes to, you know, our ability to really define like what made the change there, but it's just that like pursuit of excellence where you're always just trying to do things a little bit better. And, you know, you can look back sometimes retrospectively and say like, yeah, you know, we can generally see a trend in the right direction. So something's going well.
Training, how has it evolved? And when I say that, is it, what's the biggest change that's happened in your training over the last 5 years, say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say going back to like the idea of biology being a very like low and slow, long process, it's thinking about it that way. And that's part of just being an adult, like being more mature, is you step back and you set a long-term plan and you stick to that plan. So I'm sure, you know, I don't remember back to like what we did exactly on that day we went to Bev's, but my guess is like we showed up, we were like, that looks like a cool machine. Let's hit that really hard. And, you know, I'm still like down to do that every once in a while because, you know, it just kind of brings me back to the roots, and it's great, you know, great way to, like you said, kind of spar and meet new people. But now it's really thinking about, okay, we have this like, you know, this 2-year goal, this 10-year goal, and like, how do we work backwards from there to sort of get to this finite thing? So maybe we're doing this exercise, we're doing the set, rep, tempo scheme, but all of that feeds onto this later thing. And it used to be like, okay, we show up to the gym and the goal is to have the best session today. And that's still there, but within the confines of where we want to go. So it's much more looking at like the, you know, long-term projection and how these little things are going to add up than just trying to run at the wall every day. And I think when you're younger, and I'm still younger, but yeah, like when you have more room to progress, you can get away with that a little bit more. And I think, you know, part of the reason why I, you know, met Connor was because I got beat up. I had a lot of injuries. So a big part of my learning process, like a big problem that I had to solve, was how to not get injured. And that led me down a lot of rabbit holes as well.
That's what I find a big problem with a lot of these trainees, are that they're coming in and it really is about what are they doing on that given day. And you might disagree, and please, we always disagree with each other, but there's so much, I don't even know if the right word's variability from session to session, or maybe from one workout to a repeating workout. But if they're trying to bring out a specific body part, they're always mixing it up. I always find that they're never able to adapt because, yeah, in the beginning with these newbies, there's going to be some adaptation going on, but because they're never actually spending time understanding what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they don't have a goal in mind, they can't improve at the level that I think the body has the potential to improve at. And if you're always mixing things up, yeah, you know what, general fitness, for most people coming into your Equinox who don't have a goal and they're just like, I just want to break a sweat, look better naked, and be in great shape, then all right, man, go have fun and just, you know, make sure that you're warming up the right way and that your body's feeling good, and you know, see you tomorrow type of thing. But someone like you, very few people on the planet have a plan that's as definitive as yours. Like, you have a plan to turn around and say that by 2021, you want to weigh 300 pounds with 15% body fat on a DEXA scan. Yeah. That's pretty specific.
Right. most
people would be like, most bodybuilders that you speak to, no offense to the guys at Bev's, but they'd be like, you know, we're going to work on getting to 300 pounds from 265.
I got to get bigger.
Well, yeah, at what rate? Like, I know for a fact, and we haven't spoken in years, that you probably know how much weight you need to gain either weekly or monthly. You know how much calories are coming in. You know exactly what needs to go into your body, from a supplement standpoint. You probably laid everything out, correct?
Yeah, it's true. And all, like, biology is redundant, and it plays out in the rest of life as well. So when you talk about, people coming in and having a lot of variability, the first thing that comes to my mind is a child. Like, a child is exploring the world, and school works this way. Like, school, you get a wide base of knowledge, and then eventually you go on to get a PhD and you focus on this very finite thing. Like, as a child, again, you sort of explore the world, you're figuring out what you like, what's safe, what's not safe, and then you become more specific. You have a role in society. All of our jobs work this way. Like, you become more and more specific. There's not just one muscle and fitness person. Like, there's an editor-in-chief, right? So we all have these roles, and if you want to be really good at something, like, you have to move from that variability to specificity. So that's kind of the path there. If you want to become an expert in anything, you have to become specific, and specific by definition is repetition of the same thing, right? You wouldn't get faster at the 100 meters by practicing cartwheels. Like, you just go out and run every day. So, like, it's the same thing exercise-wise. Like, find the exercises that are going to work for you, and you can have a little bit of variety, but, variety is not what drives you forward. You only need the variety that's necessary to sort of not get sick or die. And that sounds like very broad, but...
So how long then would you suggest somebody does it? So they narrow it down. I mean, I know it's going to vary person to person, so maybe just you could use yourself as an example. You narrow it down in terms of exercise, right? So how long are you going to be doing that specific thing until you want to change it or you need to change it?
Yeah, so I guess, like you said, it's a need to change it kind of thing. But the way that I choose exercises is based on the goal of what I'm trying to accomplish. So obviously we know that, like, different exercises train different muscles, but they also overload that muscle in a different position, right? We could talk about, like, the different fibers of a particular muscle. Like, a pac's going to have clavicular fibers and sternal fibers and costal fibers, and you could focus a little bit more on one of those depending on how advanced you are, but you could also overload it in, a more lengthened or shortened position. And based on the decisions that you make there, the sets, reps, rest periods, tempos that you use, it drives a particular stimulus. So if you wanted to be a marathon runner, like, you're still using the same muscles, that you would be as a bodybuilder, and to some degree, but the duration that you do it for, the intensity that you do it for, those are the factors that now make things more specific. So for me, it's like, what goes into this goal? You're like, okay, so you want to be 300 pounds, at 15% body fat. Okay, so if the 15% body fat dictates that your goal is not to get to a fat 300 pounds, so you need to gain muscle. And then from there, you would ask, well, how do you gain muscle? Like, what's the process for that? What goes into that? And from there, I'm breaking it down into components, and I'm saying, well, you're going to, have some type of, like, we said tension before. I'll just break into the categories and not go specifically into training.
Sure.
But you have training, like, you have nutrition, you have sort of like your sleep and recovery aspects. You have, like, your internal body chemistry, your internal physiology, which you can measure and manipulate. And then you have your environment. That's, the gym that you train at, your psychology, like, do you listen to music and get amped up when you train? Like, all this stuff, affects the way that you see the world and deal with stressors. So I break it down to those components. I say, like, here's the timeline we want to do it in. And now what are our constraints? So if we got down to the level of training, we would want, all those components to support that training. So, an example might be, like, I work at this gym, Hype, and I purchased equipment there that's Kaiser equipment, and Kaiser is air resistance, pneumatic equipment. And that's going to overload a muscle a little bit differently than, say, iron would, because it has the constraints of gravity, and we can go into all that sort of stuff. But that might be more advantageous in one phase than, say, the iron would be. And, based on what I'm trying to accomplish in that phase, I might choose a particular exercise for that goal. However, on a macro level, let's just make it simple and say that was a year-long plan. The next time you come back and you go to hit that same stimulus, you repeat the same thing so that it's measurable over time. So for example, just to, make things a little bit more concrete, like the major driver of muscle hypertrophy from a training standpoint, if we went into that first category, is just going to be volume of tension or mechanotransduction. And the way that's typically measured, in research, just to simplify, is just total sets. That's usually like sets per body part, And when you say volume of tension, there's a lot that goes into that as far as like the type of exercise you're using, and you can definitely go down a rabbit hole. But just to simplify it, like sets times, basically the amount of load that you're using. So how many sets are you using? Are you getting stronger over time? Like there are intricacies to like what's happening on a cellular level and how you can manipulate that with different resistance profiles and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, like if you get stronger over time, that number goes up. And if you do more sets over time, that goes up. So for example, again, referring to Ronnie on the wall over there, if you take, the Mr. Olympias from like the past 30 or so years, we'll go back to like Lee Haney, you can create two categories. We'll call one like total sets per week and another one like total strength. And it's like, well, how do you quantify strength? Like who's stronger, Ronnie Coleman or like Dexter Jackson? Like it when you see it. It doesn't have to be scientific, but strength, right? Like again, we can get into the weeds as much as we want, but you know strength when you see it. You know which guy's stronger. And what you end up with is this amalgam of total volume. Again, in research, they usually just categorize volume as total sets per body part, but you really also have to include load in there. Because what most bodybuilders have traditionally done is their program hasn't changed much. You can go online, type in Ronnie Coleman program, go watch Cost of Redemption, and it's pretty accurate. He didn't change it dramatically over time, but what he did do is progressive overload. Yeah. So by adding load to the bar, that number goes up. Mm-hmm. Total sets, total load used, total volume goes up, right? Now, a lot of people are turning to like increasing sets because they're thinking like, all right, by trying to increase load all the time, there comes a cost to that. One is there's a short runway where you can, once you get to the sort of advanced level, you can't just linearly put load on the bar forever. Right. And the other one is, Ronnie's a perfect example, there's the injury risk to it. So another vector, to increase volume of tension, which is the primary stimulus, and there's some other ones too, to increase hypertrophy, is to increase sets. So you have these two vectors, and when you line up all these like let's just say Mr. Olympia competitors from the last 30 years, you find when you take that number, let's just say, put Ronnie Coleman on the scale, 1 through 7 on those last Mr. Olympias, he's probably the strongest guy on there. He is the strongest guy on there.
I would say. My question wasn't whether he's the strongest, who's the second strongest.
You got Phil Heath. Before Phil Heath, you have Dexter Jackson. You have Jay Cutler. Before Jay Cutler was Ronnie. Before Ronnie, you had Dorian. Before Dorian, you had Lee Haney. Right. So what you find...
Franco Colombo was up there. He was an Olympia. He was strong.
Yeah. Well, I didn't go back that far in my head. I just stopped at Lee Haney. I don't want to get embarrassed for getting some of the guys.
I love it.
But what you find is, a guy like Dorian trained with not a lot of sets. However, his strength was pretty freaking high. Mm-hmm. So that kind of moves him up on the list. You're like, all right, Dorian Yates, like total number of sets, last place. Total strength, second place, third place, whatever. You end up with this total number that's like 9. You put these guys in order, and what you kind of find is the person who did the most total work got the best results. Right. And then you have to ask, like, well, how do you do more work? Because everyone just wants to do more work of whatever their specific craft is. So again, moving from that child or that, person in grade school to the professional athlete or, the executive director. Like, if you're a sprinter, your question is, how many, above 95%, 100-meter sprints can I get in a year? And what sort of things go into that? Well, you're training the same muscles over and over again, so maybe glycogen repletion is important. If that's important, then insulin sensitivity is important. Creatine synthase is going to be important. So once you figure out what your need is, and in this case the need is more volume of tension, then you can start to create an analysis of like, okay, what components drive that?
Right. It's interesting though how, when I said earlier, it all works. It does to an extent, but yes, high volume training works. High frequency training can work, like maybe cutting the volume back and training more frequently.
Because it is more volume.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
If you go high frequency, you're just spreading out. It's just a way to spread out the volume. And if you go heavier, it's a way to accumulate volume.
That's worked a lot better on me, I think, over the last year or so. I mean, I'm 42 now, and I've really tried to become a student to just like you have. But I've noticed that in the past, say 15 years ago, when I was doing those one workout, one body part a week, crushing it with high volume, you're sore as hell. Yes, the response I was getting from the workout, I was enjoying.
It's very masochistic.
Right.
Yeah.
But like over time, I was just thinking to myself, well, wait a second, I'm practicing something 4 days a week. And granted, certain lifts, the squat, the deadlift, there's carryover, and people don't think about that either. It's like, all right, I got a bar on my back, or I'm front squatting weight, or I'm pulling weight off the floor. Like, that's a back day right there. That's a chest day. Exactly. There's a lot going on. But what I really found out was my body started responding a lot better to reducing some volume and hitting things more frequently during the week. Why is that? Maybe, I don't know, maybe because I've always been natty, maybe because of my activity level, maybe just the way that I run myself. I mean, there's so many different variables. What's your opinion on that?
The research seems pretty clear that like at least 2 times a week is the best way to go. You're typically in that 2 to 3 times a week. I don't think that necessarily, obviously they're not going to do studies in like drug using bodybuilders, but like I don't see any reason why that wouldn't apply to them as well.
Why are a lot of people still doing that once a week then? That's my question, because I mean what you just said is almost like old news. Yeah, you're still going to specific gyms.
A number of reasons. Yeah, one, when you get to, and Ronnie Coleman actually trained everything twice a week. So he had a schedule that was kind of like a push-pull lower rest. So actually he's very high on this number of sets.
Yeah.
And he's very high on the number on strength. And like you said, before we started filming, like no one's been bigger than him yet. But no one's beat that score. Maybe that's his genetics and, like the environment that he trained in again, go through all those things like that led to him being able to recover from that. Just his mentality. Even when you see him now with injury, like he's calm and cool.
Yeah.
So he's able to really reduce his like perception of threat in many ways, where all the time he's pretty cool. You see that with a lot of bodybuilders. But I do think one thing is, once you get to a certain level of strength, you can just do so much more damage to yourself. So like, if you're driving a Honda Civic around and, you crash in, to a stop sign at 20 miles an hour, it's like not a huge deal. But, you take a Formula One car out, you drive at 200 miles an hour and you hit a wall and, you're on fire. So that's the thing is like the bigger you get, the more stress you can induce on yourself, the more you take your foot off the brake. And, that's why a lot of like these group classes and things where they don't necessarily have like the best approach to fitness, they can get away with a lot of sloppy form because you're just driving a scooter around. Like it's just really hard to hurt yourself on a scooter. Like it can be done, but for the most part, like you just don't have the horsepower to hurt yourself. So I think when these guys get really big, they can do so much work in that session. Now, that doesn't mean it wouldn't be advantageous for them to spread it out a little bit more. But I think that you could certainly get away with it. And also, again, like the mentality that it takes, to be good in any sport, and, sort of every sport almost has like its own sort of psychological profile. But I think the psychological profile that comes along with bodybuilding sometimes just lends itself to that like masochistic nature. And it's very much a part of who we are. Like we want to suffer, passion itself means suffering. So we enjoy the suffering because we've linked it with this like future reward. And that's what we can do as humans. Like my dog isn't sitting there like thinking about the future reward it's going to get from being jacked. But we create this like, this vision in our mind of something, and we begin to associate, very early on, we associated that pain with some kind of reward. And we just hit that cycle over and over again. And I think people in many ways are afraid to let go of that feeling because it's so strongly associated with the rewards that they've been receiving their whole life.
Did you have something?
Yeah.
Go, take it.
I just feel like we talked earlier that, this is a direction a lot of bodybuilders are going. And I feel like I got to edit that. I feel like not as many people are taking it to this extent. I think that this is very, everything you're doing is meticulously planned. Like, I don't think it's that way yet in terms of that industry at all. I mean, and you tell me, you're the one that's around those folks more often. Like, but when you're talking to them about approaches and you're talking to them about like your prep, how different is yours to a lot of the other people you speak with?
I'm smiling because like I don't really know anybody. I don't really talk to bodybuilders that much.
But not at shows, don't you?
I don't see them. Like I don't know what they do. I don't know what they think about. Like.
But you don't talk to them at shows? Are you just
sure? Like nice packs, bro. Like I don't compete that often, right? So like I'm very much in the process now of like again coming back to sprinting. Like you're not going to go into the Olympics with 11-second 100-meter dash. You're just not ready yet. So the reason my goal is what it is because I know the size that I need to be competitive at the next level. And for me to continue dieting down just to, look lean all the time takes away from that long-term goal. So yeah, like, you had some pictures of me competing like as a teenager. Literally the next time I competed was like 8 years later.
That's the guy I was expecting to walk into, by the way. I thought they were recent.
Yeah. So the next jump is not that far away, right? So if I competed in 19 and I'm looking to compete again in 2 years, like those gaps get smaller and smaller because again, specificity. But yeah, honestly, like the people, I spent enough time in the bodybuilding world early on. I watched like I had a Netflix subscription when they used to just mail the DVDs out, and I watched all of the Battle for the Olympias, which, man, I don't even think I could watch those now. Like they're boring. Like they're really boring. Like you have to be kind of a psychopath to be into that.
I actually enjoy the Olympia. I mean, I enjoy going to some of the prejudging, and I think the finals is a little long, and I think it can get a little redundant with watching guys continually come out, and the next thing you know you're there a few hours. But I don't know. There's something. I just had good memories when I was a lot younger. I think I saw Ronnie win 3 or 4 times. I saw Cutler win once. One of my best friends who passed away, him and I went to our first Olympia with him. So I always have a good memory of like the Olympia weekend and the expo, and it was just something funny. We have to ask you this question because people are going to be very curious. So you're obviously very intelligent at what you do. You obviously put a lot of thought process behind your type of training. But what does a training split look like? What does your diet look like?
Yeah.
So let's start with training split because I know that's if you're able to discuss that.
Yeah, totally. Let me think what the best place to start is. I mean, I'll go a little bit more micro because I think I'm kind of like living out here a lot. And so just looking at it on a week type basis, it's like an upper body push, upper body pull, lower body, then typically a day off, and then rinse and repeat.
So closer to what Ronnie was doing.
Similar, but with a little bit more of a context of what goes into those days and why. So Ronnie, for example, had like a back thickness day and a back width day, and there's like some like great quotes that like Ronnie was almost right about a lot of things but didn't know it. Like my favorite Ronnie Coleman quote is someone asked him the same question, like, Ronnie, describe your training to us, and he said, well, as heavy as possible for as many reps as possible. And that was the whole answer. And he's so right. Like, it's totally true. So same thing. He had sort of like a back thickness day to back. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that there are like different compartments, to the lat. Like there are different fibers that run in different directions. And coincidentally, like doing some horizontal stuff and some vertical stuff, which was his sort of plan. Like his width day was a lot of vertical pulling, and his thickness day was a lot of horizontal pulling.
Yeah.
So, I don't break it up necessarily horizontal, vertical. Like it's a little bit more complex than that. But I do have like an A day, a B day, a C day, a day off, and then an A1 day, an A2 day, and A3 day. So I do hit things. If you look at it, what you would see is I hit something every 4 days. So it's 3 on, 1 off. So it's not quite twice a week. But also because, again, of sort of like my psychology, I like to train to failure. So, I can hit something like every 3 days, but 4 days tends to be a pretty good sweet spot for me because that's just how I like to train. So it ends up being pretty high volume and relatively high intensity. But intensity in sort of like in exercise science terms usually means percentage of 1 rep max. Like if you're actually talking in exercise science terms, intensity is merely just like, how close you are to your 1RM. In this context, what I mean is really RPE, or like how close you are to failure. I tend to train pretty close to failure because that's what I like to do. But yeah, so you have an A, B, C day, A1 day, A2 day, A1, B1.
What are you varying up from the A to the A1?
Yeah.
How is that looking different?
Yeah. So for example, like on the first A day, let's take an easy example and say like lower body, right? I might focus a little bit more on like a hamstring glute dominant focus on one of those days and more of a quad dominant focus on the other one of those days, but they still have components of each.
Yeah, sure.
And then I'll also change where things are overloaded. So for example, like take a squat. Like what's harder, the top of a squat or a bottom of a squat? Like the bottom of the squat, right? So that's the hardest point of the squat. So your quads are overloaded in a stretched or lengthened position. And because of that, it's a stimulus that lends itself, to a little bit more damage. You're going to tend to be more sore after something like that. And then you could take like a leg extension, for example. That's going to be hardest at the top. That's going to overload you in like a short position. Throwing a band on something might make it a little bit more overloaded in that position.
Right.
So I'm using different exercises, different machines to change where something is overloaded and which muscles it's hitting.
So you're really trying to manipulate where you're feeling tension on the muscle.
Not just feeling, but it's like I'm not going by feeling. Like I know what I'm doing. Meaning, like, I didn't just go in there and say, oh, I could feel this in, like, my vastus medialis. It was like, oh, we know based on, like, biomechanics and anatomy that this is what this hits. Like, there is a degree to, like, yeah, there's sort of the mind-muscle connection. But there's also just, like, if you're in a preacher curl and you flex your elbow, your bicep's going to be trained because that's what a bicep does.
So we talk about that for a second, Zach, and this is interesting because what do you say to someone who says, well, I don't feel it in that area? I mean, what is your thought process? Naturally, the biceps flexing.
Yeah, it's going to supinate. Yeah,
right. It's, in my opinion, the biceps working. Well, a big complaint I hear is when someone's doing like a pull up or a lat pull down. Like I feel it in my arms, and that's normally by some newbie who doesn't have that type of connection. Yeah. What type of advice are you giving to someone like that? Because a lot of the viewers are going to want to know that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely form advice. Like in some things, you're just not going to see that. Like if you put someone in a machine and the only thing you can do is pretty much isolate the exact motion that muscle is intended to do. Obviously there's going to be, you're never really perfectly isolating one muscle, but very few people are going to get in a preacher curl. And if I overload it even shorter, like say put a band on it or something, and it's really tough in that short position, like, I don't know, everyone's going to feel their bicep in that position. Yeah. So that's one of those things where like you don't have to coach so much. Where if a lat pull down, for example, like the lats are crossing, multiple joints, so you have to deal like with your humerus, but you also have to deal with the position of like your spine and your pelvis and how all that stuff is interacting, so there's a lot more complexity to that. And that takes some degree of coaching to get right. And I could totally see people, say feeling their arms more, in a lat pull down. Now, granted, like the lats are still going to work, but for sure not as advantageous as they could be if you did the correct thing, like with your humeral position.
What's the last workout you did? Do you remember it?
Yeah. So today's Wednesday. Today was actually that recovery day, which actually might be kind of interesting in itself. Let me go to
the last one first because I feel like people want to know what it is you're doing, and then definitely please talk about the recovery.
So the last workout would have been like a pulling day.
Okay.
And so this was mostly on Kaiser equipment. Okay, so this kind of complicates it a little bit more, but the Kaiser equipment is pneumatic resistance, which means it's air resistance. there's some nuances to what you get out of air resistance. Like, first of all, iron resistance, it has mass to it, and it interacts with gravity. Like, the reason it's heavy is because gravity is pushing down it at 9.8 meters per second. With air resistance, you're not subject to that anymore. So that changes things a little bit. One of the things that it changes is that you can't create momentum. So if you take something with mass to it and you create some degree of like acceleration, right, it's gonna float, right? So that's only because you're creating enough acceleration where it's overcoming gravity. Okay, so take a bench press, for example. We said just like the squat, the bench press is hardest at the bottom. Okay, and you're doing the most work at the bottom. Now, let's say I just give Don 25s on each side. And Don's a pretty strong guy. And I say, Don, I want you to move this thing like you move 400 pounds, right? He's going to explode off his chest. If he lets go of the bar, it keeps going. Right. So he has two choices. Either he can let go of the bar and hope for the best, or he's decelerating as he's coming up. So he's doing all the work at the bottom, and then the rest of the way he's decelerating. The only time that doesn't happen is when it's a max effort and you're trying to accelerate it all the way through. Okay, but if it's less than that, you're doing the most work at the bottom, and then you're decelerating. With air resistance, it doesn't work that way. There's almost no mass, or you can create a situation where there's almost no mass, like in a machine where the arms are, say, weightless or a pound or two. So as soon as you add air resistance to that, you can't actually create momentum. You cannot throw the bar off your chest. It's always pushing back against you the way a gravitational force would push back against you. So one of the benefits to that is reduction in injury risk, because the point where you're the weakest oftentimes is also the point where there's the most resistance. So you're trying to create this like acceleration force. Your joints might be in a compromised position. Let's even say like a leg extension, for example. You try to accelerate it out of the bottom, create some shear forces there. A lot of that's necessary, but, just that initial momentum and then the deceleration, creates some joint stresses that could be advantageous to avoid. Now, I still use iron, but there's times where I would want to use air in particular. So with that being said, like the first exercise we did was a row for the lats on a piece of Kaiser equipment that was like a low row. And the low row, what it does is it sort of like drives your elbows down. So if I really want to hit the lats, and in this case, again, you have like multiple fibers going in multiple directions, and we would set up exercises that sort of would train like a more horizontal or vertically oriented fiber. And in this one, I'm going to lean forward into the machine. I'm going to focus on driving my elbows down and a little bit in. That's our first exercise. We were doing, I think 5 sets that went like 8, 6, 6, 4, something like that. The idea is basically like you have an opportunity to hit failure multiple times. So maybe you do your first set of 8 at 100 pounds, that's like 8 or 9 out of 10. Your second set of 8, could be a 10 out of 10 at 110 pounds, and then you just kind of repeat that process throughout. It also gives you an opportunity, again, to add sets like week by week. It just gives you some opportunities. Again, we're looking for this like long-term process of accumulating volume. So I want as many opportunities over as long a period as time to make increases in volume without ever getting to the place where I can't load anymore. So a lot of times people have very short phases, let's say like 3 weeks, and then they deload because they get to the point where they're like, oh, I can't put any more weight on the bar. And it's like, great, you just did, a 3-week hypertrophy block, but hypertrophy is a very long process. And if you just did 3 weeks and then you go out of it, nothing happened. Like you're literally just starting to create like the underlying cellular adaptations and like machinery that you need to, ultimately manifest that process. So you need to create a plan where you have room to progress. So anyway, we would go from that row. The next thing And in that row, actually, we did like a quarter rep in the beginning. So the lats are pretty strong, like in a lengthened position, but most machines overload the short position. Think dumbbell row. Dumbbell row is hardest at the top, but you're strongest at the bottom. So with this particular piece of equipment, it's very much overloaded in the short position. You're weakest there. I want to overload the lengthened fibers. Or I want to overload the fibers in a lengthened position. So I'm doing like a quarter rep and then a full rep, quarter rep, full rep. Went to like a high row after that, a lat pull down. This stuff is all in the Kaiser. It all has nuances to, what we'd want to do with the form. By the time we got to the lat pull down, that was paired with a bicep supinating, bicep curl, a little bit more overloaded on the inside. I have these little incremental plates I can put on the inside. Biceps are mainly supinators. Like they're kind of stabilizing your arm, like in humeral flexion. They do flex the elbow, but in that bottom position when your elbow is extended, a lot of that's going to be like brachialis. So a lot of what biceps do is supinate. Like you can curl pretty well even if you have a detached bicep. So we overload the inside, supinate there. Again, we use the Kaiser equipment to do like a more neutral grip curl that was overloaded in a lengthened position, which hits like the brachialis more. So that's kind of like how I'm splitting it up. And the other day, I'm actually at a different gym, and I'm using mostly iron equipment, and again, sort of different resistance profiles. So the first thing is a vertical pulling movement, and that one is kind of overloaded in a mid to short range. And you're just kind of making a list of like these are the positions, these are the muscles we want to train, these are the positions that we need to train them in. This is the total sort of volume that we need. And then you just fill it in. And the more you learn, the more you understand, like, here's the big categories, and then here's the tools we have within these categories. When you first start off, like, you might not even realize that, like, tempo is a thing, or you might not realize that, like, strength profile, resistance profile are a thing. So, but it's good because, like, you don't really need to do that stuff. And, like, most of my clients, like, I'm conscious of that, but they're averaging maybe 2-3 times a week. So that's not my main priority. I have a very different mentality when I'm thinking about that population. And some people listen to this and be very overwhelmed. And it's much more about like, what's the next step in front of you? Like you have this whole staircase. Like I wouldn't necessarily put this all on someone on day one, but you just need to find the next step in front of you. And that's great because you'll make a lot of progress with that step and then climb to the next step after that. But I think it's really knowing like what are the big time buckets to fill, and then the more you learn, you start to learn, man, there's like even more finite stuff within this bucket. And it's the same for everything. Like you get down to like, we constantly find smaller and smaller things within the cell. We get down to the level of the cell, and then you're like, okay, we have, organelles within the cell. And then, these things are made up of constituent parts, are made up of electrons and protons, and these electrons and protons are made up of quarks eventually, and it just gets smaller and smaller, and like eventually we find the next smaller thing. And then in the other direction, we find the next biggest thing. So we're just constantly expanding the same way, the universe is. So that's what's happening knowledge-wise, and you just have more and more sort of like buckets to play with, and I think that's really fun because what happens is they usually are pretty succinct with what you knew before. Like it's very rare that you you come across a supplement and you're like, this doesn't work along any of the lines of everything else that I knew previously. It tends to be you get to a point and you're just like, this fits in with everything I knew to this point. Or you meet someone and you're just like, the way this person is talking jives with everything on my most basic levels of understanding of physiology. And if it doesn't, you immediately have a red flag, and it's really easy to decipher who you want to listen to.
Good way of putting it. Before we
just wanted to hear about his recovery real quick.
Yeah, that's what I
That's cool. Yeah, like because
definitely.
Yeah.
And then I have one quick question, and then we'll wrap.
What is it?
You go first.
Oh,
The recovery day, your Wednesday, which was today.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly say, again, not getting too much into the weeds, but typically recovery is a much bigger picture. Like there's a lot of components that go into that come down to like your perception of threat in the environment. But as far as what I did today, I went to the pool. I did a pool workout, and you know, I think of like Space Jam, like Daffy Duck's got this like floaty on. That's me, and it's basically me and a bunch of, you know, like there's like 80-year-old women in the pool, and I'm in like the what they call, I think, like the recreational area or something like that. It's basically like women doing like water aerobics around me, and guys too, and so I'll get in the deep end, I'll float for a little bit, and I'll run with the like aqua jogger belt on, do something that kind of looks like a dynamic warm up. What I'm thinking there is I'm looking at it from an aerobic standpoint, without really having the forces of any kind of like ground impact. So I'm getting the aerobic component from the heart in two ways. Like one, just I'm moving there with very little impact. But two, the compressive forces of the water are actually, the heart's pumping against that, and they're sending them back up to the heart, and the heart gets a nice like pre-fill from that, sort of like a jellyfish, right? And when I think about opposing sort of what I'm doing from a resistance training standpoint, or trying to create some variability, right? It's like we said before, we want specificity, but too much specificity is death. It's stagnation. So you want as much specificity as you can possibly get without consequences that are too great. So, you know, if you want to be 300 pounds, like what's one consequence you might have? Like maybe your cardiovascular system. So what can you do that will take away the least from your resistance training goals and allow you to improve that component? So the pool was one of those things. And again, like even just think about people wear the like Normatec compression gear. Yeah. Same kind of deal. You got that compression that's sending the blood back up to the heart.
How long were you in the pool for?
That takes about 30 minutes, like 30, 40 minutes.
Get pruny. You got to get out.
Yeah, I mean, it was pouring out. I'm like pruny right now.
So, okay, 30 minutes. So that's the beginning.
That's the beginning. Okay. Yeah. I mean, literally, like, it probably starts when I wake up, but, you know, we don't have the time for that. But just in this component, like, before I came over here, the sauna was next. I do 2, like, 20-minute bouts in there. There's really good like long-term research, 30, 40-year studies that show that the sauna improves cardiovascular health. Very similar to the way aerobic exercise does. A lot of the mechanisms are very, very similar. So I look at that as another way that's low impact cardiovascular fitness.
Why the 220? So you do 20-minute bout? Do you do like a cold plunge, or do you cold shower?
I do
in the
cool
back?
off a little bit, not so much because of the benefits of like the cold, but I'm just trying to cool off. And
how much time do you spend out of it? So you go 20 on,
about 5-10 minutes. Yeah, as long as I need. I'm just trying to accumulate the most total time. So what I'm looking for is, again, it's like every 4 days, right? And if you look at the research, it's a pretty linear like dose response curve to like the frequency and exposure of people like going in the sauna to the decrease in mortality and decrease in like adverse cardiovascular events. So that's what I'm looking at there. And not to mention, like when I get in that sauna, I remember Will Smith being interviewed, and he was saying, when I get on the treadmill and there's a guy next to me, like there's two things that's going to happen, right? Yeah. So when you get in that sauna, there's people coming in and out. And, there was times when there was no clock, and there's certain places where there's no clock. And I just think, okay, I wait for like 4 or 5 people to leave. And then someone sits down, and you just think like, this guy's got like, he looks like he runs Tough Mudders. He's got the watch on. Like he's like your typical kind of like self-quantified guy. And I'm like, I'm not leaving before this guy leaves. Like, I don't care what happens. Yeah. So you kind of, it is that, cardiovascular component, but I've also learned there's a meditative component to it as well. And it comes back to, when you're in training and you're dealing with that discomfort. And part of that discomfort is heat stress. Right. So you are also in training sort of that grip. But I mainly look at it from, a cardiovascular component and just sweating by itself. Like obviously we're sweating during training, but sweating itself has benefits unto itself.
I love it. Last question, because I could sit here and talk to him for I don't know how much time, but I know we're about to exceed. Could you break down for us really quickly, and this is going to be more of the 1,000-foot view. But for you to get to 300 pounds right now, can you give everyone an example on what your daily macros would look like?
Yeah. So right now they're like right around 5,400 calories total. So the way that I look at it is like calories per kilogram or calories per pound. And typically for people, like if we're going in kilos, for example, you're going to find they're gaining, and it depends how experienced you are, but someone who's like fairly experienced, as a competitive bodybuilder, in that like 35 to 45 kilocalories per kilogram kind of range. So I'm right at that 45 end now. And the reason I'm at the top end of that is because, as like our jobs are pretty active, and just living in the city, I'm doing 12, 15,000 steps a day at 265, right? So there's a nice, even just rhythmic cardiovascular component to my day already, right. Which is great. But the downside of that is you got to eat a lot of food. So from there, you have your total number, and right, like in order to gain, in order to gain weight, like you ultimately need to put something in. Like that mass doesn't come from anywhere. The energy isn't lost. So it comes in and you gain that weight. So you start with like, what's the total that you need, and then you break that down from there. The next component you'd go into macronutrient wise is you'd say like, okay, protein, because that's something again you can set just based on like a kilocalorie like grams per kilogram type of range, and that's typically going to live in the 2 to 3. Most
2 to 3 grams per pound of body
per kilogram.
Oh, per kilo.
Okay, so think like 2.2 grams per kilo is a pound, right? So when you're in that 3 end, you're really at the top end number. Right. I mean, a lot of the recommendations are going to be more like 1.8, even less grams per pound.
That's for weight gain though.
Not 1.8, like 0.08 or something. Or dieting is typically going to be a little bit higher. But let's just say, like, just to make it simple for people that are in the U.S., you're going to be under 1 gram per pound pretty much all the time. If you're at a gram per pound, like, you're good. Yeah. You don't need to worry about it. Like, if you want to make it really simple, which it should be, like, put it at a gram per pound. Don't think about it. I tend to live a little bit on the higher side of that because I've found the carbohydrate values that I need to hit to get to those total calories are super high. Right. And with that can come some gut distress, and you have to be really careful about where you're choosing your foods from. Mm-hmm. So the next component I would go into is fat. And for me, there's been these phases, in history where we say, well, fat is bad and now fat is good. But from the perspective of a bodybuilder, I like to keep fat as low as possible. Fat is still the easiest thing to be stored as fat. Like, it doesn't, require insulin to do it. Like, fat, literally just like 2 droplets on a plate comes together. So it's very clear in like carbohydrate overfeeding studies and things like that, the easiest thing to turn into fat is fat. And then carbs and then protein.
So your main fat consumption is coming from the protein that you're eating.
Yeah,
like you're not adding any external sources, correct?
Except, and this is why we could talk for hours. So there's just a lot of layers of this stuff. Sure. Like, I could get down to like get down to like literally the minerals and stuff like that. But so what I do for fats is, because again, for me to get to that number, I could be 900 grams of carbs. But when I get to that level, even with very careful carbohydrate sources, like things that digest pretty easily, most people try to be like higher fiber. But when your carbohydrates are that high, you actually want to keep fiber pretty low. Like, you want things to pass through pretty quickly. You typically want things, that just reduce gas and bloating. I think low FODMAP for a lot of people, as trendy as that sounds, that's what I do. Yeah. I'm very specific on my carbohydrate choices. White rice makes up a ton of my carbs. I make sure that I hit, the standard amount of vegetables and, some fruits in there as well. But for fats, what I do is I actually add a ton of MCT oil as well. So MCT is another one of those things that's like not going to be as readily stored as fat as, say like a long chain triglyceride. Mm-hmm. So what I've found is, like, let's say 2 tablespoons of MCT oil is, 28 grams of fat. And then MCTs are a little bit less calories per gram than other fats. Mm-hmm. So you're going to be a little bit towards 8. So you have 28 times 8, that's 160, 64. That's like 224 calories. I think I did that right. 28 times 6, 120, 48, 168, something like that.
Sure.
So whatever, we'll take my word for that.
Number, it would have been like,
right,
yep.
but then, so divide that by 4, you know, and you end up with like, okay, well, how much rice would I need to eat to make up for that amount of MCT oil? And then you look at 2 tablespoons of MCT oil, and you look at, you know, a cup and a half of rice, and it adds up. So every meal I'm putting in 2 tablespoons of MCT oil, because that's something that doesn't cause me personally any digestive distress when it's in a mixed meal, in a large mixed meal. It's readily used as energy. You know, when I dug through the research, you find like in studies where people are having trouble, you know, either digesting foods or keeping on weight, that they'll often use MCT oil. Like there's a lot of the good research you're going to find, you know, for growth, for example, is going to be in children and elderly, or in trying to pick what foods you might use, might be in like disease states. So I'm looking at, you know, they're using MCT oil in disease states. It's easy for people with, you know, say a short bowel syndrome to digest. It's going to be pretty easy for you to digest as well. Sure. So I'll add, you know, 112 grams of fat just from MCTs alone. That allows me to start, you know, a hypertrophy block, you know, in the 500-600 gram range for carbs, rather than in the 800-900 gram range, so that I can escalate there.
800-900 grams is that's a lot of rice. I remember when I was doing I shot the cover of Muscle and Fitness last year, and when I had 4.5 weeks to prep, and up until that point,
you're welcome.
I was I basically was consuming about 450 to 500 grams of carbs a day, and I was doing it mainly through sweet potato, because my body just does better with sweet potato than it would do. I love rice, but I know from a bloat standpoint, digestibility standpoint, I just felt like my body would look a little drier. And then when I had the 4.5 weeks, I dropped from 500 grams to 300 grams, and I basically I lowered my fat from 125 to 90 and kept my protein the same, and I just stayed there, and like every week was like.
And you were confident too when we spoke that you could do it.
I was confident, but I was also like, I was a little bit of a skeptic the first week. After the first week, I was like, do I need to make another adjustment? And I was talking to Ben House. Dr. Ben House, and he was just like, no, it's working. Just stick with it. And I kind of stepped back. I'm like, you're right, it is working. And I just kind of laid there, and then like every day I was waking up, and I was like, oh my God, like I'm getting like, it's kind of funny. You know how it is. I mean, you've done it on a way higher level, but your body just starts changing, and you start seeing veins come out, or you look a little more vascular in your upper chest, and you just start learning to trust that process. Where, 5 years ago, it'd be like a water deload and, all this crazy crap that you probably still have to do, but I just don't do it because I'm not getting on stage. I'm trying to come in with something I can pretty much maintain all year long.
I mean, how much do you sleep? Because just hearing about your food and what goes into it, I'm exhausted. I'm just curious as to like how you kind of keep up on everything.
No, it's awesome.
No, but it's exhausting to how much goes into it. It's a lot of.
But you have to love it.
Oh yeah, I know. That's what I mean. It's a lot of prep, but it's also because you have this goal in mind that you want to achieve. So it makes sense that you're motivated to continue it. But for somebody that doesn't have that goal, I'm like, holy shit! Like, there's a lot going into just his meals. And even more, I'm sure, goes into the recovery and training aspect, because especially the recovery, since we only talked about a very small portion of it, but Don, mentions it a lot. That's the other times you're not in training. Like, everything else is going to build toward that. But yeah, I mean, are you just like sick of food? Like, do you just like hate it?
If you could just take a pill, you would.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but in either direction, it's like that. Like, your body's just trying to bring you back to homeostasis, and it changes your psychology, right? It just makes, it'll be all right if you just do this. So like, literally the way that you see the world starts to change, because your body doesn't want you to go there. And your physiology is just going to send messages to your brain, and literally the way that you see yourself in the world, the way that you feel is going to change to try to put you back there. Like, a good example would be you're sick, and it's like you just want to lay in bed and not eat. Your body did that to you for a reason, because it's a good idea. And what you see, like you mentioned, sleep, like I measure my sleep. I use the Oura Ring. And, for me, that's a really good tool, because I can track things like heart rate variability, respiratory rate. For most people, like looking at their heart rate variability, on a day-to-day basis, or I look at things again sort of more low and slow. So I'm looking at it, on a month-to-month maybe basis. is not going to really determine much of what they do. But when I'm using these markers, I'm looking at, I'm expecting to see deviations because I know that I'm pushing my physiology in a direction it doesn't want to go. And then you have to ask yourself, what's an acceptable level of deviation? So every time you make these jumps, whether it be, from, 240 to 250 or now from 265 to 275, you start to see those markers, drop off. Yeah. And, you have consequences like to your health, and you have new problems that you have to solve because your body doesn't want you to be there. And it has to deal with the consequence of this new muscle, this new weight. So a lot of bodybuilders are facing things like, like a sleep apnea, if we're talking about sleep, for example. And then you'd have to break that down and say, like, what are the components of that? Like there are, obstructive, just mechanical components. So you might learn more about anatomy and, what you could do with your body to sort of change those obstructions. Just understand breathing on a different level, and mechanically you could change that a lot. You might change your sleep environment. We have the blackout curtains, like the room is set 60, 65 degrees, but with like a chili pad also like on the bed. And all these little things that you're doing to maybe solve a problem. Right. At one point, it was like, okay, you've eaten to the point now where you're starting to get some like acid reflux. Well, what's the etiology of that? And then you find, well, like maybe it's actually not having enough acid. And that's another. So you come up with, as you try to push your physiology further and further, you're presented with new problems. And it's your body just pushing back to try to bring you back to where you were. And we can do this as humans because we have this belief in this future self. So we keep finding new ways to sort of solve these problems. And that's kind of the process, like I was saying in the beginning, is just finding those ways.
So there's a cost to doing business. I mean, he's trying to put on an incredible amount of weight.
Right.
He's doing something that I couldn't do. I mean, this is insane. Most human beings can't do that. But he's also giving himself the best possible opportunity to be healthy because of all the other things that he is doing for his body, that you are doing for your body, and that takes a huge thought process. And you hear about bodybuilders that unfortunately are dropping dead, and specific things that are happening with their health, or just going through a list of names over the last decade that have lost their life. Ethan's someone who's putting a lot of thought into this, and this is the way I see things going.
Right.
Unfortunately, he's one of the earlier guys to do this.
Right.
You wish a lot of other bodybuilders would take this approach. Otherwise, you can't just throw food in your body and just go pump iron and just expect, yes, there's going to be some change to a specific point. And at that point, it's like, all right, nothing's happening anymore. And that's why it's so impressive what he's doing. And honestly, man, like, we really wish you all the luck with this stuff. And I know Connor said it to me. Connor Ryan, a phenomenal physical therapist, said it to me when I met Ethan. He says he'll be on Olympia stage one day, trust me. And he just kind of went off, and I was like, hey, I'm just meeting this guy, and he was, a little bit bigger than me. Now he's a freaking monster. And but it is impressive to see his trajectory and what he's doing. And
next time I want to talk about how you like the ring and like the differences between the ring and like other things like the whoop. There he goes.
Knocking off.
There he goes again.
There's been a. Actually, you didn't get that on camera? How'd you not get that on camera? That's been a consecutive three straight episodes where I did that. So you think you guys are moving, but you didn't.
No, in fact,
I'm not taking the blame.
It's actually like looser now, so if you just brush against it, it falls. Yeah. Anyway, Ethan, thanks, man. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for coming in.
My head's still spinning from a lot of things, specifically just you going through your meals. But
hopefully next time we can like go into a specific topic, break it down a little bit more.
But it's interesting though. It is. It's interesting, but it's just a lot that's poured into it. And I think that what Don's saying is a lot of people still they don't know how much is going into it, specifically for people that are coming at it from a new direction. And like Don said,
this is great. This is more of an intro today, and this is more of like, this is who this guy is, and this is his background. And I think we could definitely build on some topics if you're up for it in the future.
Cool, man. Thanks again. No, go for it, Don. It's episode 500.
Episode 500. Yeah. Guys, thanks for joining us. You can go to www.muscleandfitness.com. Reps.
At muscleandfitness.com if you want to email us.
You've been doing it every time.
At Don Saladino on Instagram.
Zraz.
And you don't have Instagram?
I have an email.
He's got,
I probably shouldn't give that out, though.
Contact Pat Davidson on his social
or just
channel.
Do that, yeah.
Send a smoke signal to Ethan.
We'll have all the information below.
Yeah.
We're just joking around, guys. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time.
Thanks.